Hello, Professor and fellow classmates. I will be speaking on a subject that I'm very passionate about, and this is the risk of youth growing out of care to become chronically homeless adults. On any given day, there are nearly 438,000 children in foster care in the United States. In 2016, almost 700,000 children spent time in the U.S. foster care system. On average, children remain in state care for nearly 2 years, and 6% of children in foster care have languished there for 5 or more years. Unlike young people making the transition to adulthood who rely heavily on their parents for emotional and financial support, the approximately 27,000 foster youth who age out of care each year must make this transition solely on their own. As a result, securing a safe place and stable place to live has become one of the major challenges that foster youth are experiencing today. Inadequate housing and homelessness are significant problems that youth and young adults who are aging out of foster care in the U.S. experience more than their same age peers, resulting in a significant risk of youth growing out of foster care to become chronically homeless as adults. It is estimated that some 23,000 youth age out of care each year. In terms of living situation, estimates are that between 11 and 37% of youth who are aging out who experience homelessness one or more times in the years following their transition, and an additional 25 to 50% experience housing instability. Homelessness is defined as spending one or more nights sleeping in a place where people weren't meant to sleep, or sleeping in a homeless shelter, or not having a regular residence in which to sleep since leaving foster care. There are three types of individuals who are considered homeless, and that's the transitionally homeless, which are those who experience short-term temporary homelessness, the episodically homeless, who shuttle in and out of homelessness, and the chronically homeless, who have recurrent and extended stays in homeless shelters. There are also many risk factors associated with the chances of youth becoming homeless. Researchers acknowledge that the path to adult homelessness often begins in childhood. These kids experienced physical abuse by the primary caregiver, long-lasting impacts of childhood stress, with the greater number of stresses increasing the risk of homelessness and leading to mental health issues. There are 11 to 12 different forms of trauma, which are both the cause and consequence of homelessness, with family violence being most prevalent. High prevalence of adverse traumatic childhood events such as sexual, physical, and emotional abuse, as well as placement in foster care. Also engaging in delinquent behaviors, running away from home, either the parents or the foster care, living in a group care setting at the time of the initial interview, which is close to the time of aging out, youth who were parents who had recently experienced housing instability, and African Americans had approximately twice the odds of experiencing homelessness in the year after exiting foster care. Youth who had experienced disrupted adoptions, multiple foster care placements, especially in congregate care settings, which are settings with a mass amount of people, as well as youth involved with the juvenile justice system. Historically, beginning in the mid-1800s to the late 1910s, it represented something of a paradox regarding youth homelessness and morality. The social reformers and progressive of this period contend that the moral responsibility for the problems of youth, such as poverty, poor health, and crime, as being one of the larger society, the inequities of a capitalist system. Vagrant children were placed in prisons and orphanages and made to live in deplorable conditions. Most were severely malnourished, with 1/8 of them dying from a communicable eye disease infection, um, which caused them to go blind due to ophthalmia. The paradox from the moral perspective of these movements is that while they located more responsibility in the larger society, they were also responsible for the criminalization of running away and the creation of the juvenile courts and the concept of delinquency as we know it today. In the 1910s to 1930s, youth homelessness was considered to be an individual deficiency, such as a form of fundamental pathology or genetic defect. Running away was attributed to the child's inability to perform in school, control their instincts, and learn social and moral functioning. The etiology of these programs were believed to be associated with the subnormal appearance of such youth who had physical characteristics such as thick lips and ears outstanding, which was amazing. In the 1930s and 1940s, there was an emphasis on macroeconomic factors such as social economic influences on behaviors such as running away due to extreme poverty and the family problems stemming from this poverty. Running away was deemed a normal reaction to abnormal circumstances, prompting the inclusion of the runaway reaction in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. Running away was considered a um, behavioral disorder of childhood and adolescence, and it is described as individuals with this disorder characteristically escape from threatening situations by running away from home for a day or more without permission. Typically, they are immature and timid and feel rejected at home, inadequate as well as friendless. They often steal furtively. From the late 1940s to the late 1960s, psychopathology once again became the emphasis, and there was a shift to the macro level explanation, which concluded that the problems were cultural rather than economic. The counterculture movement of the mid 1960s to the early 1970s was associated with the increasing public recognition of youth homelessness and the large numbers of youth traveling due to the dissatisfaction with the establishment. Rejection and abandonment of mainstream values and beliefs were believed to be the cultural norm for many youth at the time. In the 1990s, the predominant perspective once again retreated from the macro level explanation to one involving abuse and instability amongst families of origin. Researchers found focused largely on high incidences of physical and sexual abuse and neglect in home and emphasized general histories of dysfunction and instability, including frequent reports of domestic violence, parental criminality, substance abuse, poverty, frequent moves, and changes of school. Laws in some laws and policy and programs that really impacted this issue was the social political movement, was implemented a program of social control that resulted in improved morality and respect for cultural standards. The social reformers and then progressives contributed enormously to the undertaking of addressing the deplorable conditions of the prisons and orphanages. In 1974, the United States federal government implemented the Runaway Youth Act, and decriminalization of running away brought increased legislative attention and funding. In the 1980s, they established the Independent Living Program, which addressed the needs of the youth by implementing programs which included instructional programs that focused on job readiness and retention, nutrition, housekeeping, transitional housing, and assistance obtaining a high school and or college degree. In 1999, the Independent Living Program was replaced by the Foster Care Independence Act. This act created the John H. Chaffee Foster Care Independence Program, which increased funding and expanded eligibility to aged out youth up to age 21. The Department of Housing and Urban Development Family Unification Program, it provided vouchers for housing choice and other services, but it was restricted to 18 months. In 2008, the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoption Act were implemented, which allows states to administer reimbursable adoption funds, foster care, or guardianship assistance payments for youth up to age 21 as long as the youth was engaged in secondary, post-secondary, or vocational education, working at least 80 hours, or if they were unable to participate in educational activities because of a medical condition. Services that are available at the our Department of Housing and Urban Development, Foster Care Alumni of Michigan, Vista Maria Shepherd Hall Transitional Living Program, Community Housing Network, Michigan Homeless Shelters, and the Angel House Child and Family Services. I found all these services on MARE.org, which is the Michigan Adoption Resource Exchange. It's for local and state services. Also, you can find schooling, mental health, and behavioral services on the MARE site. Um, Employment services, IEPs, healthcare, legal care, as well as services for those in the LGBTQ community. For my interventions on the micro level, my first priority would be safety and permanency. I would utilize the transition to independence process model TIP, whose focus is on youth and young adults ages 14 to 29 with or at risk of emotional behavioral difficulties such as mental illness. Also, the restorative approach, serving professionals working with groups of youth exposed to trauma in the mental health, juvenile justice, and educational fields. On the mezzo level, I would focus on reunification with the family first, involve them in interagency collaboration and support groups or mentoring programs such as the Silver Lining Mentoring, which are for youth who are currently or have experienced foster care prior, or the Big Brothers, Big Sisters. On the macro level, it's funding, 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 and more funding. We are in desperate need of more funding in order to have the resources to meet the needs of our children who are aging out of foster care in order to prevent chronic adult homelessness. In conclusion, I have a lot of thoughts about the plight of our homeless youth and adults. I have worked in group homes, which, like my current placement, that have provided shelter, schooling, employment. Because a lot of the children have some mental health issues, so they provide funding, for make it possible for them to get their education, and their medication. I'm sorry, as well as education. And so I do know that there are resources available. So my questions would be uh, whether or not these individuals are privy to the resources. Are there many barriers to these resources? Are they just not taking advantage of the very available resources that's out here? Um, I honestly believe that's just a little bit of all of those factors, along with the barriers such as the stigma associated with mental health and the stigma associated with being homeless as a whole. I know that at my placement, I deal with young adults 16 to 24 years of age, and although a lot of them have come seeking safety and seeking shelter, um, a lot of them still had been on the streets and homeless, for a considerable amount of time, like 6 months or a year, just because they didn't want to come and seek the help. They felt embarrassed about being homeless and being in the situation they were in, which oftentimes is not due to fault of their own. I also know that a lot of our children fall through the cracks of the foster care, child welfare, educational, and penal system, which would suggest a need for a stronger, more effective interagency collaboration. As social workers, I believe it's imperative that we assure that our clients have access to these resources through advocacy on the micro, mezzo, and macro level. Um, like once again, oftentimes, our clients are just not aware that these services are available, or will not come in and get them. And then are those who with mental illness or people with disabilities, who are not able to do it for themselves. I think it's, our responsibility to make sure that they are afforded the